Welcome back to the Female Genius podcast. And guys, I have been getting into my Greek mythology bag. Okay, I went to see Hades Town a couple weeks ago, and that's been on my musical theatre bucket list for ages. My friend Simran took me for my birthday. Super duper grateful, and it was phenomenal. Like, guys, for a good 3 weeks, I was just singing, "Way from me, I'm coming." Like, that was stuck in my head. Every single time I was watching a show, I'd watch Severance, I've watched flipping Bob's Burgers. I'd be like, guys, do you not see how they're alluding to Orpheus and Eurydice? I was one of those insufferable people. That was me the entire time. And if you don't know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, because this is quite important, I would say, to what we're going to speak about today, I'm going to be doing you a quick retelling of the original Greek myth of Orpheus and Eurydice. Maybe I'm going to rebrand this as the genius retelling of whatever story I'm going to take. So, our main guy, Orpheus, is the son of a muse, and there are two different dads that he may have. Like, we're not sure, but one of them could potentially be Apollo, and one could be some other guy that I don't know. Okay. And he was gifted with this divine musical talent. Like, this is the type of talent, like Beyonce level, probably beyond, like the type of talent that they said would stop rivers from flowing and cause wild beasts to like become subservient and tame just by hearing him play his lyre or hearing his song. And one day he meets and falls in love with a nymph called Eurydice. Now, nymphs are like young women in Greek mythology that are usually associated with a natural environment, such as like the river and forests and things, and they're largely associated with like things like purity and just being really beautiful, lovely young women. Technically they aren't immortal, but they live really, really, really long lives. So Eurydice was a nymph, and she also met Orpheus and fell in love with his voice and him as a person, and their love was just deep and pure and wholesome. And it was this type of love, like, you know, when you see this couple, whether it's a movie, whether it's a book, whether it's in real life, and you see them and you're like, your love is so beautiful and pure, something is gonna go wrong. Like, this is too good to be true. And if you thought that of Orpheus and Eurydice, you were right, right? Because one day Eurydice was wandering through a meadows and she was chased by this weirdo. Like, I don't even want to tell you his name because he was a flipping weirdo and he was thirsty and ugly and he was basically being a massive flipping predator and was chasing after her, right? And so while she was running away from the predator, she ends up stepping on a venomous snake by accident, and that venomous snake bites her and she dies instantly, falling and losing her soul to the underworld, right? Never to be seen again. Orpheus was so heartbroken and devastated that he refused to accept her death and decided to journey to the underworld with just his lyre and his voice in hand to go and rescue Eurydice and to get her soul back again so they can spend the rest of their lives together. If he wanted to, he would. Oh my God. Anyway, so he went down to the underworld, and Hades and Persephone and all of the beasts and characters that are in the Greek underworld were so moved by the beauty and story and sorrow in his song that Hades granted him a rare mercy, right? That Eurydice could return to the land of the living, but under only one condition: that Orpheus must not look back during the journey from the underworld back to the land of the living, right? If he looks back even once, she would be lost to him forever. So essentially, he had to have faith and trust that Eurydice was behind him and safe and sound. And he began that long, arduous, silent walk out of the underworld. And Eurydice silently followed him in the shadows behind, right? But Orpheus was human. Okay, he was just the man, guys. I don't know if you're deep in the musical theater world, but if you've the Odyssey, the musical, I'm just a man. I promise you, this whole episode is not me singing. I just have so many musical references when it comes to Greek stories. Um, but with every step, like, he would long to hear her voice. Is she safe? Is she really behind me? Is Hades actually that nice of a guy? Is he really gonna let me go away with my girl? All of these doubts played his mind. What if Eurydice doesn't want to be with him? What if he doesn't love him anymore? All of these things. And just as he could see the light of the land of the living, right, he turned around way too soon. And Eurydice was still in the shadows. There was a moment where Eurydice and Orpheus look and lock eyes with each other, and then she was gone, pulled back to the underworld forever, right? And then grief-stricken and inconsolable, Orpheus spent the rest of his living days wandering the world alone, refusing to love anybody else or refusing to sing of love and only singing of sorrows and heartbreak like Adele. Now, okay, well, eventually their souls get reunited in the underworld and they live happily ever after when they're dead. As most romantic stories portray, most tragic romances claim, Achilles and Patroclus, Romeo and Juliet, all of that stuff. Now, the metaphor of Orpheus and Eurydice, looking back, could be explored and spoken about in various different ways. Honestly, I feel like I could start every single episode of the podcast with this Orpheus and Eurydice story and link it to what I want to talk about today. Okay. But I want to see and position Orpheus looking back as this metaphor for one's fear of the loss of love, right? Eventually, his fear of losing Eurydice and not trusting that Eurydice would be there ended up leading to him losing a relationship and the love of his life. And I often think about how characteristic this feeling is for Gen Z, for myself, for my friends, and from my wider community beyond. How we are afraid of romantic relationships and love and commitment in varying facets. And in today's episode, I kind of want to talk about situationships and Gen Z dating culture and romance. And this is something that is very deep and requires a lot of nuance and perspective and different lenses. And I'm going to try and treat this almost like a review, a literature review. Yes, that's what I'm going to try and teach it by. I'm going to give you guys a bunch of different thoughts, a bunch of different opinions, a bunch of different lenses to look at things at, obviously with personal anecdote and a brilliant sense of humor, right? So you to kind of take away and go and digest and think about in your own lives and have those conversations with people in your lives or have conversations with me in other social media. Anyway, welcome back, geniuses, to this episode of Female Geniuses, where we kind of talk about situationships.
Female genius.
There are many different reasons and many different articles that explore the potential reason why that a lot of teenagers and young adults are entering more situationships and are foregoing traditional romantic relationship structures like being boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever the sort. I also want to actually caveat at this point now that I'm probably going to speak about relationships in a very heteronormative way because that's what a lot of the research and articles have done. But I do think there is something to be said, and some of this information can be garnered or applied to the LGBT community. But yeah, just if I go he or she or men and women, that's just a lot of the data that's just been studied in that context specifically. So there are many reasons, and there was this Atlantic article written about a year or so ago, or maybe a couple months ago, entitled that teens are foregoing a classic rite of passage. And in this article, it talks about the concern that a lot of the adult generation have about teens and early adults not entering romantic relationships, and the concern that this might have on their emotional development and social development, and essentially society and the social hierarchy that we live in. There are many different reasons, and I guess the most light reason that I think is interesting to explore initially is this idea that the transition into adulthood takes longer, right? You start entering very serious romantic relationships in which you are considering people as life partners when you start to transition more into adulthood, when you start settling down, when you gain more financial responsibility, when you have a full-time job, when you're able to move out of your own house and have your own space or buy your own house, right? And all of these stages are pushed back because of the economy, because schooling has now taken longer. All of these things are taking longer for young people to achieve. So maybe it's actually not a point of concern that people under the age of 25 aren't entering serious romantic relationships soon because the timelines have just been a bit pushed back. And maybe we should be more expectant or expect to enter more serious relationships in 25 to 30 and beyond. And maybe this is characteristic of why we have situationships and we're just having fun. Those are things that teenagers typically do. Those confusing, long-winded, whirlwind type relationships. We're just having them a lot later because of the structure of our society now and the burdens and the pressures of young people from a financial and economic and social perspective. That could be potentially one reason that is driving this situationship-like culture. But another large reason is this idea of the fear of commitment, right? Situationships are defined because we don't want to commit to people. I always say that I feel like situationships give people an easy out, right? So for example, let's say if I'm talking to someone and I'm in a quote unquote situationship and then they start talking to other people, realistically, they aren't my boyfriend or they're not my girlfriend. And then therefore, I can't be like, how dare you cheat on me? Because then they could turn around and say, but we're not even in a real relationship anyway. In the words of Chappell Rowan, like, like this is casual. Is it really casual though? Is it really what we're doing here? And I think it does give people the sense of out, especially when there is such a fear of commitment. And this fear of commitment can stem from multiple places, but I think it's a point to talk about why Gen Z has such a large fear of commitment. There was a 2023 Hinge survey done that 56% of the participants in this survey had a fear of rejection that kept them from pursuing a potential relationship. And 57% of this participants in this 2023 Hinge survey refrain from confessing their feelings out of fear it might be a turnoff. So the rise of nonchalance and acting like you don't care is real. The idea of being scared of being told no, or that you are too ugly, or you are not my type and you're not for me, is something crippling people into the point of inaction. And I think this is really, really interesting to kind of delve deep and to explore. Lots of young people are scared of having feelings or being the first one to admit feelings, right? Even if you look at the language that we use, oh my God, I caught feelings. Like we're talking about it like is it sickness, it's like illness, like it's COVID, okay? I like to make it akin to the anime Love is War. And if you never watched the anime Love is War, the whole concept is the two main characters, male and the female lead, both really like each other, but there is this inherent belief that whoever admits that to the other person that they like them first is the loser in the love game. So the other person has to try and get the other person to admit first. Like it's just this game of using tactical war tactics to try and get the other person to admit that they like them so they can feel like they have the upper hand in the game of love. And that is honestly very representative of the relationship society that we live in. The first person to say that they have feelings or confess feelings is often the one that has the most to lose. You're putting all of your cards out on the table in something that has become a very complex poker game. If we really think about and talk about love and the way people talk about love, don't do this, do this. If he texts you back, then wait 2 hours to reply. Don't wear this. If he's doing this, then go and do this. And there's a lot of social rules and social expectations and guidelines of how to keep a guy on his toes, how to keep a girl on their toes, right? How to maintain a steeze or all of these things, right? Which has made love and relationships a lot more complicated than it needs to be. Me personally, I don't fuck with nonchalance. Okay. That's actually, I think, a recent realization that I've come to at the age of 22, because when I was like a lot younger, 2019, 20, I was like, please don't be icky. Don't tell me you're obsessed with me. Now I do not believe in nonchalance. Tell me you're obsessed with me. Tell me I'm the love of your life. Tell me the minute you saw me, you thought you wanted to marry me. Because like one of my, like, yeah, be obsessed with me. It makes sense, Tell me that, love bomb me because why would it, which is toxic in its own way. But the rise of nonchalance is something very, very interesting. And the fact that people feel like love is a losing game, it then begs the question to try and unpack and think about, what about love feels like a sense of loss? And I think we can then begin to explore a little bit about the anthropology of love articulated by Helen Fisher. I love Helen Fisher. I watched her TED Talk when I was 17, and I think it really reframed and changed some of the way I thought about romantic relationships and I perceived romantic relationships and also neuroscience in general. I think it kind of kickstarted my fascination about how hormones and the brain govern and dictate our actions so much as a society. I just found it so fascinating. I actually think when I used to post YouTube videos really, really regularly, before I even started the podcast, before I even went to uni, so when I was like 17, 18, I did an episode on love and talking about Helen Fisher's theory of love. Now, in Helen Fisher's theory, she describes three distinct but overlapping brain systems, right? You have lust, attraction, and attachment, and different hormones and different brain modes govern these systems. And while they can overlap and they're not necessarily clean-cut transition phases, they tend to be quite distinct, and there are characteristics applied to the feeling of lust, attraction, and attachment. Lust is governed by sexual attraction, right? You find a person hot, the other person finds you hot. You want to fuck them. That's literally it, right? And attraction is more, you're starting to get to know a person. You're attracted to their mind. You like the way they live their life. You find it amazing. And attachment comes through an increase in oxytocin and things like vasopressin, where You love spending time with them. You feel a sense of loss when they disappear and they go. And Helen Fisher famously compares being loved to being on cocaine. And those feelings and those influx of hormones and emotions are akin to being on a drug. And that is why we feel such a depressive state when somebody breaks up with us or somebody that we really love or are attached to in a romantic way leaves. I've done an entire episode in season 1. I think it must have been episode 2 or 3 where I can talk a little bit more in depth. And that's not the purpose of this episode, but there's no way I could talk about love and relationships and not bring out the brain and hormones because it's the real shit. And so I wonder if because our brains are almost like being on cocaine when we're in romantic love, and we are very cognizant and we're so aware of different stories of love, different stories of heartbreak. Orpheus and Eurydice, for example. I read a book and I'm crying. I subconsciously experience like the heartbreak a book character is going through. Or a girl is doing story time on TikTok, how I found out my man has 4 baby mamas and all of this stuff. We are inherently feeling and experiencing the emotions of thousands of people every single day, or empathizing with the emotions of thousands of people every day. And we begin to see the repercussions of being underneath or influenced by this drug called love, allowing us to have this sense of fear and develop almost emotional guardrails and parameters to protect ourselves in some kind of way and some capacity. And some of that comes with the fear of rejection and the fear of commitment.
Female genius.
We can also potentially link this to a sense of political, financial, and social instability that Gen Z experience on a greater scale and a greater level than people from previous other generations. And let me actually define what I mean before somebody goes, we lived through World War. I shouldn't actually say that in a voice. That's so offensive. Before somebody, rightfully so, says we lived through World War II, all of these things. But because of the access to social media, the internet, and, you know, the news and having our phone basically be like a second organ in our hand with news articles and TikToks and all of these buzz, 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 right? We are so aware of all of the negative and terrible things that are happening in the world constantly. We are also aware of how these negative, terrible things are having an impact on people that maybe not even within our community and beyond. And while that has very positive effects in terms of us being socially aware about some of the terrible, terrible things going on in the world, it does make us slightly more apprehensive because we know too much of what's fucking going on. And so it might be easier to enter situations where it's easy to end and there's a lack of definition and a lack of accountability because we don't even know if we're going to enter another lockdown tomorrow. Somebody was telling me bird flu this, bird flu that, risk of another pandemic. And I sighed because this is a completely valid concern because before COVID, we'd be like, that could never happen. And we lived through it. We lived through COVID. We're living through 2 terms of Trump. If you're from the UK, we're living through Brexit. There's so many things that we are just so exposed to and aware. We're living through one of the worst job markets ever. We're living through a time of such political uncertainty and instability. And so it makes sense to be able to want something that you can end easily. And there's a lack of accountability for ending it, right? Because once you start having the conversations of what are we, it also isn't about what we are now, but it also means what are we going to continue to be? How are we going to define ourselves for our friends and our family and the people around us? When I think about my future and I think about the things I want to plan and the decisions what I make, now that you are now included in that, you are now a defined label in my life. I am now going to have to take this into account into decisions. Your dreams and the things that you want to chase now inadvertently become intertwined with mine. And these are all things considered. If I was in a situationship and I wanted to pick up and move to New York for the next 10 years of my life by myself with nobody, just me, a cat, and my bank card, right? I could do this. And it could be so much more easy to end than a rooted and secure and long-term relationship. I often think about a lot of my friends in relationships. And it's very interesting to hear about the way they talk about their future and the way I talk about my future. And I'm not necessarily saying that it's a negative thing or one is better than the other, but I tend to notice that my friends in relationship are often considering their partner, which I don't think is an unfair thing. Before, when I was younger, I used to think, oh, that's so crazy. You need to be as selfish as possible. You need to think about this and this and this. But I just respect that they value different things in life. And that's something they inherently value and they want to prioritize and continue to build throughout their life. And I don't really care for it. But it's just very interesting because they're like, oh, we, plan to do this, or when we do this, or, if we end up doing this. Whereas my scenario is completely based off of me. And that gives me a large sense of comfort because if I knew I wanted to take an opportunity in Boston tomorrow, my future is hugely and largely just defined by the things that I want and the future life I want to build by myself. And very few people are considerations in that fact. But I also think that there is something to be said about, the importance of community. I've talked about loneliness and this idea of third space and the importance of friendships when it comes to having a good life and great mental health on this podcast in 3 episodes before. And this might be a fourth in a weird way. And talking about this, but there's this Esther Perel quote, and if you don't know who Esther Perel is, she's like this relationship expert, and she has this podcast which I absolutely love, but I cannot remember the name of it for the life of me. But she says, and I quote, that today we turn to one person to provide what an entire village once did, a sense of grounding, meaning, and continuity. At the same time, we expect our committed relationships to be romantic as well as emotional and sexually filling. Is it any wonder so many relationships crumble under the weight of it all? I think we have an awareness and we put a lot of pressure on romantic relationships. I honestly blame Disney. Okay. And there are slowly studies starting to come out about the effect and the Disneyfication on our perspective on relationships. Okay. And I know I could do a whole episode on that. Not to say I don't love a good Disney movie. One of my favorite Disney movies is Tangled. That romantic relationship when he's swimming in the boat and then he looks at her and her eyes widen and oh, I'm a romantic at heart. But if it is something to be said, we put a lot of pressure on romantic relationships. We put them on such a pedestal, I think, especially in our generation. We want a partner that fulfills every single one of our needs. Our partner has to be our best friend, right? But our partner also has to, sexually turn us on and sexually fulfill us. And our partner has to be a form of emotional support. And for women and sometimes men, a partner also has to be a form of financial support, right? They need to feel grounded. They need to feel safe. They need to feel fun. They need to feel exciting. They need to feel romantic. They need to feel spontaneous. They need to be able to gossip the way the girls gossip. You need to be funny. We also have to have similar interests. We need to also do this together. We also need to do that together. And when you put that on such a pedestal, it does kind of start to make sense why less people are wanted to be in a relationship, because romantic relationships, this title, boyfriend, girlfriend, wife, husband, or whatever you choose to name or label your romantic relationships, it start to come with this added pressure of, oh my God, I don't know if I can live up to this expectation. This is something I tend to feel a lot because I was discussing this with my friend Janai last week when we went to go watch that Sinners movie. Oh, guys, that should have been my cold open. Guys, I could do a whole episode on that movie. I've seen it 3 times. That movie is so. That's all I can. That scene. This isn't a spoiler, but there's a spoiler. It's not a spoiler. It's not a spoiler. There's a scene where he goes, "I love you. I think about you every day. You know, I just want you to be somewhere safe. But that was never gonna be with me." So with the music in the background by oh, my poor little heart. Anyway, but okay, back to what was I talking about? Sorry, I had visions of Michael B. Jordan in my head, and then I started thinking about this movie. I need to reset. Hold on. What was I talking about? Janai, right? So me and my friend Janai, after watching the Sinners movie, went out to go eat, and we were talking about romantic relationships because one of our friends popped up and was like, "Hey, I think I want to be in a romantic relationship," and we're like, "Oh, betrayal, disgrace, shame." Ring the bell, shame, right? Whatever. And we were just basically talking about actually why is it that we have avoided romantic relationships or we're currently not in one or any kind of sense. And I remember telling her, like, I just don't, it sends me to points of confusion when people like me. Like when people admit, I like you, Jesse, or I had romantic feelings to you, it's a massive point of confusion because I don't see it. Like, why would you ever want to be with me? Like, I do not think I am this girlfriend material. And again, is that subconsciously that I put romantic relationships on such a pedestal that I feel like only certain individuals can mold themselves and fulfill it, rather than it being you meet somebody, you have feelings for them, you explore it to whatever extent that you want it to be. But is that not what a situationship is in other ways, just without predefined labels? Is situationships really that bad if you have rules and things and your feelings are not hurt and both parties are happy? But is it inevitable? Is it like a friends with benefit situation? Like because with friends with benefit, I'm spitballing out loud here. But with like a friends with benefit situation, like somebody always catches feelings. Like it's never just the benefits, right? It's always somebody's always going to catch feelings and get hurt at the end of the day, even though there's such defined rules in what it is. But because of the nature of the with benefits, it's inevitable that somebody feels something more than just friends.
Female genius.
I also think that a lot of young women, as a result, not only because of taking the step back from from putting relationships on a pedestal, a lot of young women especially are exasperated at the current dating market. Men are also exasperated by the current dating, but women, we're tired, bro, right? Particularly those in heteronormative relationships, right? Women largely are beginning to focus more on cultivating friendships and career and personal development, right? Citing similar experiences across the board, such as sexual harassment, misogyny, and dishonesty from men. Women are tired of being treated as a placeholder or fulfilling nature. I remember I watched a TikTok and the discussions in the TikTok comment section were really, really interesting. And this TikTok, or the message of this TikTok, was this man, red pill, I'm assuming, complaining about the fact that women nowadays aren't like their mothers. They don't want to be traditional women. They don't want to be this and they don't want to be that. And I actually think this conversation piece is quite interesting because we glamorize and we glorify past relationships and the relationships our parents had or the older generation has had. And we're like, oh, my mom used to do this for my dad and they were so happy and they were so happy. This. And I find it very interesting because a lot of the girls that I speak to in my immediate circle, so again, this is a very, very small sample size, are so aware of the things that their mom had to put up with as a result of the nature of the romantic relationship that they were in and how stifling it was because of some sort of societal expectation that was on them. I have had a multitude of conversations with my auntie being like, do not allow, for example, in the topic of financial dependence on a man, that is something that's been drummed into me by my auntie from a young age. Please do not ever be financially dependent on a man, because the minute he decides to stop loving you in a certain way, the minute you don't fulfill a certain desire or need to him, you are now like almost like a slave because you are financially your home, your livelihood, everything, your lifestyle is just dependent on this man. And it was just drummed into me that even if you love him and you claim to love him, he can remove that like that. And I think a lot of men aren't privy to some of the conversations or some of the things women see in their mothers. They're like, for example, that experience of recognizing that your mom was once a girl too, or your auntie or whatever feminine or mother like counterpart you have in your life was once a girl too, with the same hopes and dreams and aspirations that you had. It begins to question, where did those things go? I mean, I feel like every girl or most girls have had this example, this experience of watching a movie or going to a musical theater or watching or being around something and hearing their mom being like, wow, when I was younger, I really wanted to do this. Why didn't you? Oh, well, I met your dad and this happened, or this happened and this happened, but I'm happy with my life. But damn, like, I wish I had time to pursue it, or I wish I had time to do this and I wish I had time to do that. And so we see all of the sacrifices our mothers have made, you know, and sometimes they are happy, they're fulfilled through their children, but there becomes this question of, would I ever be fulfilled the same? And I just think it's another interesting piece to add to this conversation of situationships. For a lot of women, romantic relationships are almost being seen and taught and explained to them as a loss of freedom. I now have to be like a certain person. I am losing a sense of freedom. I might lose my dreams. I might disappear, right? Under and into this man and be what this man wants to be because I love him so much. I want him to be happy. And so this starts to disappear. And that becomes a real fear for a lot of women. I think situationships kind of distance and minimize a lot of that fact. It gives you this sense of freedom to explore, freedom of options, freedom to cut off, freedom to not feel attached to somebody else's dream and to only be attached to your own. And I don't think that's inherently selfish. I do think it's almost a response, a secondary hand response to the trauma that previous generations have had and now that we are beginning to witness.
Female genius.
I also think this brings me nicely to kind of talk about the gender war, right? We are in the moment of gender cold war. There have been loads of studies saying and showing you how women are becoming more liberal and men are becoming more right wing. And ultimately, that is a problem. If your values do not align, you can never enter a committed long-term situationship. Sorry. You can never enter a committed long-term relationship. It's hard, it's difficult, it's gritty. Because when push comes to shove and you're having to make those important decisions in life, you are going to clash every single time, right? And there is a lot to be said. I blame largely social media, red pill content, red pill men, the economy, all of these things to the gender cold war. And men and women are becoming more politically and socially incompatible. And that is the true fact. And in all honesty, no, in all honesty, there have been loads of studies showing how men benefit the most from long-term romantic relationships. Men benefit a lot more from this than women do nowadays, especially when you remove or you add the piece of women gaining financial independence, right? And when the economic factors of a relationship are no longer, as pressing as they were before, we start to see how men benefit largely from women's emotional involvement. For a lot of women, they are very good, and I'm generalizing here, at building community. Women are very good at building community, getting together, supporting one another, having this emotional intimacy within friendships in a way that is supportive and healing and so amazing. Okay. Whereas men, they're not very good at this on statistically and according to the paper. If you have an amazing male friendship, I'm so happy for you and I think it's so great. But male friendships don't have that same emotional intimacy or they struggle to build that. So a lot of the time, a lot of these social skills, a lot of this emotional intelligence and a lot of this emotional intimacy is taught and provided through romantic relationships. And so when less and less people are entering romantic relationships, less and less men are being aware or empathetic to the plight of women's troubles because they can only learn that or have only been taught to learn that through romantic relationships. And this largely causes a massive, massive issue because as less and less people are entering relationships, less and less men are learning emotional intimacy, emotional intelligence, and that is largely what a lot of women now require in their relationships. And the men are still focused on very traditional means of attracting women, built board, lots of money and status, things that women less and less are beginning to value. I'm not saying there aren't women that value earning lots of money, being good looking, having a great body. They're all great and important factors. But in terms of sustaining a long-term relationship, emotional intelligence is one of those key factors. A lot of women will come and tell you that the main thing they would want out of a partner is for them to be a kind, good, loving person. And that doesn't align with some of the values that these red pill men are teaching one day. Those fret and fish fresh and fit people that sit around with a bunch of women and they're like, yeah, this and that. I do that. You should do. And it's just appalling. Honestly, it makes me sick to my ugh. Even had that situation of that dear wifey guys, okay, let me tell you about this podcast episode. So this is a podcast for um what's it called? As if it's a Christian podcast where like married couples come and they talk about their relationships and stuff. It's called Dear Future Wifey. I hope that the intention is to kind of encourage and teach people how to navigate long-term relationships and marriage and that whole transition period through a Christian lens. Hopefully supporting young couples or people entering that phase of their life with some of the issues and things that tackle. Beautiful message, terrible execution. This man and woman, pastors of a church, leaders of a congregation, right? Spearheads of the Christian faith in their community, guiders, mentors of their community and the romantic relationships that are facilitated in their community came onto this podcast. And she was basically talking about how he was a cheater. And she was like, but I was graced by God to stay. I was graced by God to enter that relationship. And then he was banging on about, yeah, she wasn't my type. I usually like Latinas, she's like not built, she's bigger, she's darker than I would want, all of these different things. And she's smiling and be like, yeah, yeah. And then everybody's like, oh no. Oh no. This is appalling. Like, how are we supporting this? And there's another clip going around of a different couple on this podcast. But I guess it then begins to come and show and say that, again, women are watching this and are saying, if this is what it means to be in a marriage, I don't want to be in it. I think social media has such negative perceptions and negative views on how we view committed long-term relationships because we have the super perfect, amazing couple and we then put them on the pedestal and the standard. And if none of the guys or people that we meet that standard, we then, oh my God, freak out. We're not like this. We're not doing this. We're not doing this. Or on the flip side, we see a lot of failed relationships and we begin to, again, feel or experience that secondhand trauma that people have experienced and then project that into the ways that we perceive men or women or romantic relationships in real life. Again, leading us back to the same situation of situationships. Because ultimately, as human beings, we crave romantic and sexual relationships and or sexual relationships. Obviously, there's a subset of society that don't, people who are asexual or aromantic, and we validate your experience. And they go through their own troubles in a different lens and a different sense. But situationships, do they actually allow us to cultivate healthy relationship styles? I think it's interesting because I think situationships are fine if they are done through the lens or through the avenue or the angle of, hey, we're just in it for a good time. These are our ground rules, but I don't really want to put a label on it. and these are the reasons why I don't want to put a label on it. I've had, my parents were divorced, and I just know, I just want to see, but I have great feelings for you. And these are the rules we're going to put on it. For example, monogamous, I don't want you to be with anyone, we're exclusive, blah, 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 blah. If you would like to call me this, then you can call me that. And having a very healthy conversation about what that means and what relationships look like for you, and defining, creating your own relationship standards, I think are super healthy. And I'm so glad that Gen Z is entering the point where we can have conversations about polyamory and open relationships, and really customize and design relationships and almost create a sim-like style to suit who we are as individuals, rather than a one size fits all. And I think that's amazing. But I do think if we're entering situationships from the lens of a fear of commitment through all of these various issues, from the gender cold war to a fear of commitment, having relationships done on this pedestal, to having a fear of social, political, and financial instability, and all of the different lenses that I proposed in this episode, that is a point of concern that we then have to talk about and address. I hope you enjoyed this episode. I found this episode really interesting. This is something I definitely talk about with my friends in different facets and settings. I hope it has kind of acted a little bit like a literature review, and acted like in a way to, support like your findings and your conversations, and be like, oh, they spoke about this. I've referenced a bunch of different articles, mainly actually for this episode, over research papers, because the articles quote a lot of different research that I don't have access to and I find really interesting. So if you want to read and learn a little bit more and develop your own opinions and explore some of the opinions of other people, then I will link all of these articles as per usual down below. Guys, it's 11:43. 11:33 p.m. I think I'm bugging out. But again, thank you so much for watching. Anyway, yeah, I'm super excited, guys. I just don't really know how to end this season of the podcast. Like, I'm trying to figure out when is a good time to be like, okay, because we've reached the point, we've passed the number of episodes in season one, but I still have a bunch of things that I still want to talk about and dive into. Like, I'm not out of ideas, but am I stretching it? Do I need a break? Do I need to go back to the drawing board? I also have this really fun episode series that I'm planning, where I'm getting a bunch of like my closest female friends, and we're gonna sit down and we're gonna have a good old-fashioned yap about one of the topics that I've explored in the podcast. So whether it's authenticity, or it's situationships, or it's the Fermi paradox, like, we're gonna sit down and I'm gonna talk to my best friends about it, and it's gonna be so fun. But that's 6 episodes. So I don't know. I don't really know. And I'm starting to think about the aesthetics of season three, the things I want to include in season three, but I just don't know if season two is ready to end. Does it ever have to end? Can it not be a party that goes on forever? It just keeps going on and 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 on, like Bruno Mars's Vegas residency. Is he still there? How long is a Vegas residency? Is like 5 months. I'm so sure. I'm so sure. Anyway, thank you so much for listening to this. I think this is kind of unique, but I think every episode is kind of unique. It's like, it's its own thing. Anyway, thank you guys so much for listening and watching, or wherever you're doing this. And I will see you guys next week for another episode of Female Genius.
Female genius.